What if one phone call could change everything? The sun was beginning to dip low over Brookstone Estates, casting long golden shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns and pristine driveways. Brookstone wasn't just any neighborhood. It was the kind of place where the grass was always neatly trimmed, the cars were spotless, and the sidewalks looked like they had been poured just yesterday. It was quiet, orderly, and predictably safe. At least, that's what the residents liked to believe. 16-year-old Elijah Brooks didn't think much about any of that as he walked through the neighborhood. His gym bag was slung over one shoulder, and the sound of music pulsed through his headphones. He had just finished an intense basketball practice at Franklin High, and his legs ached from hours of running drills. Normally, he'd take the bus home, but today he had decided to cut through Brookstone. It was a shortcut that would save him at least 10 minutes. He had walked this route before, but he knew all too well that his presence here wasn't exactly expected. Elijah was tall and athletic, with the smooth confidence of someone who had spent years perfecting his game on the court. He wore a hoodie pulled halfway over his head, gym shorts, and basketball sneakers that still carried the scuff marks from last weekend's game. To anyone else, he was just a kid walking home from practice. But in a neighborhood like Brookstone, appearances carried weight. Inside one of the stately homes, Linda Cartwright watched from behind a large bay window. She had lived in Brookstone Estates for over 15 years. She knew the names of every family on the street, the schedules of the landscapers, and the exact time the mail carrier arrived each day. So when she spotted Elijah walking alone through the neighborhood, her mind began to spin. Her gaze sharpened. A young black teenager, walking alone with a bag over his shoulder. What if he wasn't supposed to be here? What if he was scouting the neighborhood? Linda's pulse quickened. She told herself it was nothing, that she was just being cautious. But the doubt was already settling in, growing heavier with each passing second. Her hand hovered over her phone. Maybe she was overreacting. But then again, what if she wasn't? What if something happened and she had ignored it? Her breath quickened. Better safe than sorry, she told herself. With a deep breath, Linda reached for her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious," she said. "There's a young man walking through the neighborhood, and he doesn't look like he belongs." As the dispatcher's calm voice asked for details, Elijah slowed his pace. He felt a shift in the air, the quiet unease of being watched. He glanced toward the row of houses and saw the outline of a figure standing behind a window. His chest tightened. He knew that feeling all too well. 2 streets away, a police cruiser received the call. Officers Bennett and Rodriguez exchanged a glance as the description of a suspicious person came through the radio. Rodriguez, the younger of the two, hesitated. "Should we check it out?" Bennett's jaw tightened. "Let's go." Elijah adjusted his bag and turned the corner, heading toward home. He had no idea that within minutes, flashing lights and blaring sirens would shatter the quiet calm of Brookstone Estates, and that his life was about to change forever. Elijah was only 2 blocks from home when he heard the sharp wail of a police siren behind him. His chest tightened as the sound cut through the quiet hum of the evening. At first, he thought the officers were heading somewhere else, but then he saw the squad car pull up fast behind him. The doors flew open. "Hey, stop right there." Elijah froze, pulling his headphones down from his ears. His pulse hammered against his ribs. His mind raced, but his body stayed still. He had been taught how to handle moments like this. Keep your hands visible, speak calmly, don't make any sudden moves, but fear tightened in his chest. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why were they stopping him? Officers Bennett and Rodriguez stepped toward him, their hands resting near their holsters. Bennett, the older and more experienced of the two, was broad and heavy-set. His face was hard and expressionless. Rodriguez was younger, his eyes sharp but uncertain. "What's in the bag?" Bennett demanded. Elijah blinked. "My basketball gear," he said, his voice steady but tight. He lifted the bag slightly, showing them the drawstrings. "I'm just coming from practice." "Where are you headed?" Rodriguez asked. "Home," Elijah said. His voice was calm, but his heartbeat quickened. He pointed toward the street behind them, a few blocks that way. Bennett's eyes narrowed. "What's your address?" Elijah hesitated. His breath hitched in his throat. Did he have to answer that? But he knew better than to question them. 438 Pine Street, he said. I live there with my mom. Rodriguez glanced toward Bennett, uncertainty flashing across his face. That's a local address, Rodriguez said, his voice quieter now. Bennett wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, his eyes darkening. Why'd someone call the cops on you then? Elijah's chest constricted. I don't know. He shook his head slightly. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just walking home. Rodriguez's gaze softened, but Bennett wasn't backing down. He reached for the strap of Elijah's bag. Let me see it. Elijah instinctively pulled back. Wait, that's my stuff. Relax, Bennett said, unzipping the bag without waiting for permission. He rummaged through it, pulling out a pair of worn basketball shoes, a sweaty jersey, and a water bottle. Nothing suspicious. But Bennett's expression didn't soften. Why are you cutting through this neighborhood? Elijah's eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It's a shortcut, he said, his voice tightening. I've walked through here before. I have a right to be here. Rodriguez hesitated. His gaze flicked toward Bennett. Maybe he's telling the truth. Then why'd someone call it in? Bennett shot back. He zipped up the bag and dropped it at Elijah's feet. I'm not buying it. Elijah opened his mouth to speak, but the sound of an engine approaching cut through the air. A sleek black SUV rolled toward them, slowing to a sharp stop. The doors opened, and out stepped Denise Brooks, Elijah's mother. She wasn't just any mother, she was the mayor of Columbus. The energy on the street shifted instantly. Bennett's jaw tightened as Denise crossed the pavement toward them. She wore a navy blazer, her heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk. Her eyes were cold and controlled. She wasn't running, but the sheer weight of her presence made both officers straighten. Elijah's breath quickened. Relief and fear twisted together in his chest. He had no idea how this was about to unfold, but he knew it was about to change everything. Denise Brooks approached the scene with quiet but unmistakable authority. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she closed the distance between herself and the two officers standing over her son. Her gaze, cold and razor-sharp, locked onto Officer Bennett first. He stiffened, his shoulders squaring as recognition flickered across his face. Rodriguez's eyes widened slightly as he realized who she was. Ma'am, I need you to step back, Rodriguez said, his tone professional but strained. Denise didn't flinch. Oh, I see what's happening, she said, her voice smooth but carrying the kind of controlled force that made people sit up straighter. What exactly is the situation here? Bennett lifted his chin. We received a call about a suspicious person, he said. His tone was even, but there was an underlying edge to it. We stopped him to ask some questions. Denise's gaze sharpened. Suspicious? She stepped closer to Elijah, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Her son's chest was rising and falling with the weight of controlled breath. His bag sat at his feet, still half open from when Bennett had searched it. And what exactly made him suspicious? Bennett's mouth pressed into a hard line. He was walking through the neighborhood with a bag. The caller was concerned. Denise's expression hardened. Concerned about a boy walking home from basketball practice? Rodriguez's posture softened. He opened his mouth, but Bennett stepped in first. We were just following procedure, Bennett said. His tone tightened as if trying to reassert control over a situation that was quickly slipping away from him. Denise's gaze darkened. She reached into her purse, pulling out her phone with deliberate precision. After a few quick taps, she held up the screen. On it was a student ID photo of Elijah, next to an address that matched the house just 2 blocks away. This, she said coldly, is my son, and this is his address. Bennett's jaw tightened. Rodriguez shifted awkwardly beside him, his eyes dropping toward the pavement. Denise's voice lowered. So tell me, did you stop him because he was suspicious or because you assumed he didn't belong? Silence stretched between them. Bennett's gaze faltered. Elijah's fists tightened at his sides. His voice was low but steady. I told you where I lived, he said. His eyes flashed toward Bennett. I told you I wasn't doing anything wrong. You searched his bag, Denise added, her gaze steady. You questioned where he lived. You assumed he didn't belong. Rodriguez's eyes darted toward Bennett. He looked uncertain now, almost guilty. We were responding to a call, Rodriguez said weakly. Denise's expression didn't shift. And how many calls have you responded to that ended differently than this? Bennett's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He had nothing to say. Denise stepped forward, her gaze cold and cutting. You stopped my son, she said. You searched him. You treated him like a suspect. Over what? Her voice sharpened. Because he was black? Because he was wearing a hoodie? Or because someone in this neighborhood decided he didn't belong? Neither officer answered. Elijah's chest tightened. He forced himself to breathe. Denise's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder. Denise's gaze didn't waver. You're lucky, she said, because this time, you're not going to ruin a young man's life over a bad assumption. But next time, you may not be so lucky. Bennett's mouth pressed into a thin line. Rodriguez looked at the ground. Are we finished here? Denise's voice was like ice. After a long, tense moment, Bennett exhaled sharply. Yes, ma'am, he said stiffly. We're finished. Denise turned toward Elijah. Come on, baby, she said, her tone softening as her hand slid down his arm. Let's go home. Elijah didn't look back as they walked toward the car, but he felt the weight of the officer's gaze burning into his back as he climbed into the passenger seat. His mother settled into the driver's side, and as they pulled away, Elijah's eyes remained fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the two officers disappear in the distance. As Denise Brooks stepped out of the SUV, the energy in the air shifted. The quiet hum of the neighborhood seemed to stop altogether, as if the weight of her presence commanded silence. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and matching heels, she moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of navigating rooms where people underestimated her. But Denise wasn't here to be underestimated. Her gaze locked onto the two officers standing over her son, and in that moment, the situation no longer belonged to them, it belonged to her. Officer Bennett's posture stiffened the second he recognized her. Denise Brooks, the mayor of Columbus, wasn't just a political figure. She was a force, a woman whose name carried weight, not only in the city, but in the broader political landscape. Rodriguez's eyes widened as realization hit him like a cold slap to the face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Ma'am, I need you to step back, Rodriguez said, his voice faltering despite the attempt to keep it steady. Denise's gaze didn't shift. She walked toward Elijah with measured steps, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Without a word, she placed her hand on Elijah's shoulder. The tension in his body softened slightly beneath her touch, but his eyes were still hard, his breath uneven. You need me to step back? Denise's tone was smooth, controlled, but beneath it was steel. And why exactly would I need to do that? Bennett's mouth twitched. We were responding to a call about a suspicious person. Denise's gaze sharpened. Suspicious? She lifted her phone, tapping it twice before holding up the screen. A student ID appeared, a photo of Elijah in his basketball jersey, his home address listed below it. Her voice dropped, but it cut through the air like a blade. You mean this person? The person who lives less than 2 blocks from here? Bennett's jaw tightened. Rodriguez's face flushed, his eyes darting toward the ground. We were following procedure, Bennett said stiffly. Denise's eyes narrowed. And what part of your procedure involved searching a minor's bag without probable cause? Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. Bennett's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Elijah's voice cut through the silence. I told them where I lived, he said, his tone low but steady. They didn't care. Denise's expression darkened. No, they didn't. She turned toward Bennett. You assumed he didn't belong here, didn't you? Bennett's mouth pressed into a thin line. We were responding to a call, he repeated. Denise's eyes narrowed. And would you have handled this the same way if Elijah didn't look like he does? Silence. Denise's hand tightened slightly on Elijah's shoulder. You need to understand something, she said, her tone low but charged with energy. My son is not a suspect. He's a student, an athlete, and more importantly, a young man who deserves to walk through his own neighborhood without being treated like a threat. Rodriguez swallowed. Bennett's face darkened with quiet frustration. Denise's gaze cut toward the house across the street. The curtains twitched, and Linda's face appeared behind the glass. Her expression was pale, her mouth slightly open. Denise's lips curled in the faintest trace of a smile. I assume you've figured out by now that this situation has nothing to do with suspicion, Denise said, and everything to do with assumption. Bennett's shoulders tightened. We were doing our job. Denise's smile didn't reach her eyes. No, she said, her voice razor sharp. You were reinforcing a problem, and now you'll answer for it. She guided Elijah toward the SUV without looking back. Rodriguez exhaled shakily. Bennett's jaw locked, and from the window across the street, Linda stood frozen, the weight of her mistake settling into her chest like lead. Linda sat in her living room, her hands gripping the phone she had used to call 911 just hours before. Her fingers hovered over the screen, the weight of what had just happened settling deep into her chest. Through the large bay window, she could still see the street where it all unfolded. The squad car was gone, the flashing lights no longer reflecting against the pavement. But the image of Denise Brooks standing between her son and those officers, that image was burned into Linda's mind. Her heart hammered in her chest as the realization sank in. She had called the police on the mayor's son, but that wasn't what made her stomach churn. It was the truth beneath it all, the unspoken, ugly truth that she couldn't deny anymore. She had called the police not because Elijah had done anything wrong, but because he was a young black boy walking through her neighborhood. Linda leaned back against the couch, her breathing uneven. Her gaze shifted toward the framed family photos lining the fireplace mantel. Pictures of her son's high school graduation, family holidays, summer vacations. She had raised her children to be cautious, to look out for strangers, to protect their home. But now, she had to face the fact that her fear hadn't been about safety, it had been about perception, about race. She closed her eyes, the memory of Denise Brooks's words ringing in her head. You assumed he didn't belong here. And she had. That was the worst part. Linda couldn't pretend that this was just a misunderstanding or an overreaction. Elijah had been walking home from basketball practice, nothing more, and she had still picked up the phone. The second she saw him, a tall black teenager with a gym bag, walking alone through Brookstone Estates, something in her chest had tightened. A quiet whisper of suspicion, the kind of instinct that she had learned not to question because it felt so familiar. But where had that instinct come from? Linda's breath hitched as the thought twisted painfully in her mind. She had always considered herself a good person. She had taught her kids to be kind, to treat everyone equally. But the truth was that she had seen Elijah not as a boy walking home, but as a threat. And that wasn't instinct. That was conditioning. That was prejudice. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes. She rubbed them away, but the shame remained. Across the street, the light in Denise Brooks's house flickered off. Linda watched the house grow dark, her heart pounding. She had been so certain that she was protecting her neighborhood. But now, as the silence of the evening settled around her, Linda had to face the uncomfortable truth. The danger hadn't been Elijah. It had been her. Officer Bennett's hands rested on his belt, his expression a mixture of discomfort and defiance. Denise Brooks stood just a few feet away, her gaze locked onto him with quiet intensity. The weight of the moment pressed down on the air between them. Elijah stood behind her, his bag still slung over his shoulder, his jaw tense as the two officers shifted uneasily. Officer Rodriguez glanced toward Bennett, waiting for him to speak, but Bennett's mouth remained tight. So that's it? Denise's voice was sharp, controlled. You're just going to walk away? Bennett's jaw flexed. There's no issue here, he said flatly. Denise's eyes narrowed. No issue? Her tone sharpened. You searched his bag. You questioned him like a criminal. You assumed he didn't belong here, and now that you've realized he does, you think walking away is enough? Rodriguez's eyes flicked downward. He cleared his throat. We were just following procedure, ma'am. Denise's breath hitched. That word procedure curled in the pit of her stomach like acid. Her hand brushed against Elijah's arm, grounding herself. So, procedure is stopping a black boy for walking home? Searching his belongings without cause? Bennett's shoulders squared. We got a call, he repeated. We were responding to a concern. A concern, Denise echoed coldly. You mean a phone call from a woman who saw a black teenager and decided he didn't belong? Bennett's lips thinned, but he didn't respond. Denise's gaze darkened. What if Elijah hadn't had his ID? What if I hadn't shown up? Her voice lowered, but the weight behind it sharpened. Would you have put him in handcuffs? Slammed him against the car? Charged him with resisting? Bennett's expression twitched, but he didn't answer. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing against his holster. Denise's chest tightened. She had spent years building relationships with the Columbus Police Department, working to improve trust between law enforcement and the community. But right now, standing in the middle of her own neighborhood, watching her son being treated like a threat, none of it felt like progress. It felt like betrayal. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the pavement. "You don't get to walk away from this like it didn't happen." Her eyes sharpened. "You're going to explain to your captain why you stopped my son tonight. And if you think I won't follow up personally, you've severely underestimated me." Bennett's face reddened. He gave a tight nod, then turned toward the squad car. Rodriguez hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Elijah with something almost like regret before following. Denise stood still as the squad car pulled away, the hum of the engine fading down the street. Her hand slipped around Elijah's shoulder, pulling him close. "You okay?" she whispered. Elijah's breath shook. "I'm tired," he said. Denise's gaze hardened. "So am I." Linda sat alone in her dimly lit living room, the weight of the evening pressing down on her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of her armrest, her gaze fixed on the darkened window. The house was quiet, but her mind was loud. Every word Denise had spoken echoed through her head. What if Elijah hadn't had his ID? What if I hadn't shown up? Linda's throat tightened. She had thought she was doing the right thing. She had convinced herself that calling the police was an act of responsibility, a way to protect her neighborhood. But now, sitting in the stillness of her home, the reality of her actions hit her with brutal clarity. Elijah wasn't a threat. He was a teenage boy walking home, and she had turned him into a suspect. Her heart clenched as she replayed the image of Denise standing between Elijah and the officers, her face steady but her eyes blazing with quiet fury. Linda had never seen a mother look at police that way, with both fear and unyielding strength. What haunted her most was the realization that Denise had known exactly how that moment could have gone. Linda had imagined it as an overreaction. For Denise, it was a lived reality. Linda's hands curled into fists. She had lived in Brookstone Estates for 15 years, but she had never questioned why it always felt so comfortable. Why people like Elijah were treated like outsiders. It wasn't the neighborhood that was dangerous, it was the unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. A tear slipped down her cheek. She had called the police because Elijah looked out of place, and now that truth sat like lead in her chest. Linda closed her eyes and took a shaky breath. She had to live with what she had done. The question now was whether she would let it change her. The truth lingered in the air long after the confrontation ended. Linda's mistake was not just about Elijah, it was about the deeper assumptions that shaped how people like her viewed people like him. Elijah was lucky. He walked away that day because his mother arrived in time. But how many others don't get that chance? How many calls like Linda's end with handcuffs, injuries, or worse? That's the quiet danger of prejudice. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the back of your mind, disguising itself as caution and concern. Linda's awakening wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. She had learned that fear and bias could be deadly when left unchecked. It's not enough to say, "I didn't mean it." Change comes from acknowledging the harm, even when you didn't intend it. Denise's strength and Elijah's quiet dignity had forced Linda to confront the truth about herself, and that was the first step toward doing better. If this story resonated with you, comment 1 below. If you think there's room for improvement, comment 2. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next powerful story.